I am Maya. I am 37 years old. 5 years ago, my husband left me for my best friend while I was in the hospital facing the absolute darkest moment of my entire life. Today, at my cousin Jasmine's lavish wedding, he sat across from me and smirked, telling me that abandoning me was his best move. He had no idea that the silent woman sitting across from him was about to completely dismantle his career, his finances, and his fake social standing before the wedding cake was even cut. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stay calm while facing the people who betrayed you, knowing that sweet justice was finally arriving. The disrespect was entirely intentional. I was seated at table 14. It was the absolute worst spot in the entire grand ballroom, shoved right against the swinging doors of the catering kitchen and completely uncomfortably close to the restrooms. Every time a waiter rushed past, a blast of hot air, carrying the smell of fried appetizers and industrial dish soap, hit my table. The heavy bass from the wedding band vibrated through the floorboards, making the cheap silverware rattle against the plates. My family knew exactly what they were doing when they placed my name card here. They wanted me hidden away out of sight, a quiet reminder of my supposed failures. I sat there quietly smoothing my hands over my unbranded midnight blue silk dress. I watched the room fill with extended family members, all of them dressed in flashy designer labels, with massive logos, desperately trying to prove their wealth to the groom's affluent family. My cousin Jasmine had married Bradley, a white finance executive whose family came from old money. My family, eager to prove they belonged in this new upper-class circle, had spent the entire evening putting on a ridiculous performance of wealth and status. The empty chairs at my table were suddenly pulled back with a loud, obnoxious scrape against the hardwood floor. I did not even need to look up to know who it was. The overwhelming scent of expensive, heavy cologne announced Marcus before he even spoke. My ex-husband slid into the chair directly across from me, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. He was wearing a tailored suit that looked like it cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. Beside him was Chloe, my former best friend and his current wife. She was practically dripping in oversized jewelry, her wrist weighed down by a massive Cartier diamond ring that she made sure to flash under the ballroom chandeliers. "Well, look who it is," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "I honestly did not think you would have the nerve to show up today, Maya. Still coming to family events all by yourself, I see." I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing. 5 years ago, the sight of him would have sent me into a panic attack. 5 years ago, I was completely broken, crying on a hospital bed after losing my health, my marriage, and my best friend all in the same week. Marcus had packed his bags while I was still on medical leave, claiming he needed someone who was actually fun and not consumed by work and grief. He walked straight into Chloe's arms, leaving me with nothing but medical debt and a shattered heart. Now, looking at his arrogant face, I just felt a profound sense of boredom. "I heard you are still living in that same cramped apartment," Chloe chimed in. Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy. She reached across the table, her diamond ring catching the light again. She looked at my simple, elegant dress with clear disgust. "And still wearing those plain, unbranded clothes. You know, Maya, if you are struggling to make ends meet, Marcus, and I could always donate some of my old designer bags to you. I just cleared out my closet last week. We are doing so well right now, we really believe in giving back to the less fortunate." Marcus chuckled, reaching over to squeeze Chloe's hand. He leaned closer to me, lowering his voice so only our table could hear the poison in his words. "You know, Maya, seeing you sitting here looking exactly the same as you did 5 years ago really puts things into perspective for me. I used to feel bad about how things ended between us. But looking at you now, struggling and alone, while I am sitting here as a senior executive at a major venture capital firm. Well, leaving you was my best move. Marrying Chloe was the upgrade I needed to reach my true potential. You were always just dead weight holding me back." I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not give them the reaction they were so desperately craving. Instead, I calmly picked up my crystal flute of cheap wedding champagne. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter taste wash over my tongue. I looked Marcus directly in the eyes. His smile faltered just a fraction of an inch under my unwavering gaze. He was expecting a fight. He was expecting the old Maya, the woman who used to beg for his affection and cry over his cruel words. He had absolutely no idea that the woman sitting across from him was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital, a private equity firm that was currently worth billions. He did not know that my unbranded silk dress was a custom piece that cost more than his car. And he definitely did not know that his venture capital firm was currently in the final stages of a massive buyout, an acquisition that required my personal signature to go through. Before Marcus could try to insult me again, the heavy scent of floral perfume signaled the arrival of my Aunt Vivian. Aunt Vivian was the mother of the bride and the self-appointed matriarch of our family's social standing. She was a woman who lived for country club memberships, elite social circles, and keeping up appearances. She strutted over to table 14, her elaborate hat practically hitting the chandelier, her face twisted into a judgmental scowl. "Maya, what on earth are you doing just sitting here staring at people?" Aunt Vivian demanded loudly. Her voice was sharp and intentionally raised so that the guests at the neighboring tables would turn to look at us. "I specifically asked the caterers to put you in the back so you would not ruin the aesthetic of the room with your gloomy mood. And yet here you are bringing down the energy of my daughter's perfect day." I set my champagne glass down softly. "Hello, Aunt Vivian. The wedding is beautiful." "Do not try to change the subject," she snapped, placing her hands on her hips. She looked at Marcus and Chloe with an apologetic smile before turning her glare back to me. "I told your mother it was a mistake to invite you. A divorced woman showing up alone to a high society wedding is just a terrible look for our family, especially when your successful ex-husband and his beautiful new wife are sitting right here. You should have fought harder to keep a man like Marcus Maya, but you always were too stubborn for your own good." Aunt Vivian looked around the room, making sure she had an audience before delivering her next blow. "I remember 5 years ago when you came crying to my house begging for a loan to help with your medical bills after Marcus rightfully left you. I told you then, and I will say it again, now our family does not invest in failures. Divorced women with no careers are a liability. We only support excellence in this family. Look at Jasmine marrying into a wealthy dynasty. Look at Marcus securing executive promotions. And look at you. Still sitting at the back table, still alone, still expecting handouts." The surrounding tables had gone completely silent. People were openly staring, whispering behind their hands, waiting to see if I would break down in tears and run out of the venue. Chloe was smirking behind her napkin. Marcus was leaning back with a look of absolute triumph, thoroughly enjoying the public humiliation that Aunt Vivian was delivering. They all thought they had me cornered. They all believed their own delusions of grandeur, convinced that their rented luxury cars and heavily financed designer clothes made them superior human beings. I looked at Aunt Vivian, then at Marcus, and finally at Chloe. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply offered them a genuine, relaxed smile. A smile that seemed to deeply unsettle Marcus because he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They wanted me to feel small, but they were about to learn a very hard lesson about how the real world operates. Because while they were busy playing dress-up and pretending to be rich, I had spent the last 5 years quietly buying the world they lived in. And the circus they were putting on was about to come to a spectacular crashing halt. Aunt Vivian's smirk was still firmly planted on her face when the massive mahogany doors at the entrance of the grand ballroom swung wide open. The sudden movement caught the attention of the entire room. The string quartet playing softly in the corner abruptly stopped their performance. The wedding guests turned in their seats, expecting to see the bride making a second grand entrance, or perhaps a late-arriving celebrity guest. Instead, a tiny figure bolted past the towering floral archway. It was a little girl no older than 4. She was wearing a breathtaking cream-colored tulle dress with a matching silk ribbon tied perfectly in her dark, bouncy curls. Behind her, a towering man in a sharp black suit and a discreet earpiece jogged to keep up. He looked frantic, but completely unwilling to physically restrain the giggling child. She sprinted straight down the pristine white aisle runner, her tiny patent leather shoes echoing loudly across the sudden heavy silence of the ballroom. The guests watched in absolute bewilderment as the little girl completely bypassed the luxurious head table. She did not even glance at the towering wedding cake or the ice sculpture. She made a direct line for the back of the room, heading straight for table 14. She threw her arms out, her face lighting up with the most radiant, joyful smile I had ever seen. "Mommy, I missed you!" she shrieked, her sweet voice piercing the heavy, toxic atmosphere of the room like a ray of pure sunshine. I dropped my icy facade instantly. A genuine, warm smile broke across my face as I pushed back my chair and caught her mid-air. I pulled her onto my lap, burying my face in her sweet-smelling curls. "I missed you too, my beautiful Zuri," I whispered, pressing a kiss to her soft cheek. "Why did you run away from Mr. Davis? You know he gets worried when you run too fast in these big buildings." Zuri just giggled, wrapping her tiny arms tightly around my neck. "I wanted to see you faster, Mommy. The car ride took forever and I wanted to show you my new shoes." If the room had been quiet before, it was now completely dead and suffocatingly silent. You could hear a pin drop on the carpet. I looked up to see Marcus staring at me with his mouth actually hanging open. All the blood had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. He looked like he had just seen a ghost walk through the wall. His eyes darted wildly from my face to Zuri and back again, his brain clearly short-circuiting as it tried to process the impossible image in front of him. Chloe was sitting frozen in her seat. Her heavily manicured hand was hovering halfway to her mouth, her oversized diamond ring catching the light as she trembled. Aunt Vivian looked like she was about to hyperventilate and pass out right there on the catering floor. For a solid minute, none of them could form a single coherent word. They just stared at the beautiful, healthy 4-year-old girl sitting happily in my lap, playing with the simple silver necklace resting against my collarbone. Chloe was the first one to snap out of the collective shock, her face contorted into a nasty, twisted sneer. She slammed her champagne glass down on the table so hard that the liquid sloshed over the rim and stained the white linen tablecloth. "Oh my God," she laughed loudly. It was a harsh, grating sound specifically designed to draw everyone's attention back to our table. "This is absolutely pathetic. Maya, have you seriously lost your mind? Did you actually hire a child actor just to show up here and make yourself look good in front of Marcus?" I gently smoothed down Zuri's tulle dress, keeping my voice perfectly soft and calm so I would not frighten my daughter. "Excuse me, Chloe. Do not play dumb with me," Chloe snapped, leaning across the table and pointing a sharp acrylic nail directly at my face. "Everyone in this family knows the absolute truth about you. Marcus told me everything about your medical history. He told me how your body was completely broken. He told me your womb was a barren wasteland and that you could never carry a child to term. That is why he left you crying in that hospital bed. So who is this random kid? Did you rent her from some local casting agency to try and make your successful ex-husband jealous?" Gasps erupted from the surrounding tables. Even for Chloe, bringing up my past fertility struggles and the devastating miscarriage that nearly broke my spirit 5 years ago was a new level of absolute depravity. It was the deepest, most painful wound I had ever carried, a trauma that took years of therapy to heal. But looking at Chloe now spewing her toxic venom in front of a room full of strangers, I did not feel any pain. I just felt an overwhelming sense of pity for how miserable and insecure her soul truly was. Aunt Vivian immediately seized the opportunity to pile on the humiliation. She clapped her hands loudly, calling out to the venue staff, "Security! We need security over here right now. This bitter, delusional woman has brought a random child into my daughter's wedding to cause a scene. I want them both removed from the premises immediately. This is a high-class event, not a psychiatric ward for failed women." Zuri buried her face in my shoulder, slightly startled by Aunt Vivian's screeching voice. I wrapped my arms protectively around her, whispering that everything was perfectly fine, and Mommy had her. Mr. Davis, the large man in the suit who had followed Zuri into the room, stepped forward. He did not look like a standard venue security guard. He moved with the precision and authority of a highly trained executive protection agent. He stepped directly between my table and Aunt Vivian, crossing his massive arms over his chest. His sheer size and imposing presence made Aunt Vivian take a hasty, terrified step backward. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you lower your voice immediately," Mr. Davis said. His tone was perfectly polite but carried a lethal underlying warning that demanded instant compliance. "No one will be touching Mrs. Sterling or her daughter." Mrs. Sterling Marcus repeated the name, his voice cracking slightly. He looked completely bewildered, his arrogant posture completely gone. "Maya, what kind of sick game are you playing right now? You think you can just show up here with a rented kid and a fake bodyguard and pretend you moved on to some fabulous new life? We all know you are broke. We all know you are alone. Just drop the act. It is embarrassing to watch you try so hard." Chloe smirked, regaining her false sense of superiority. "Exactly. We know how much debt you were in after the divorce. You probably spent your last credit card limit hiring this guy to walk you to your car. You are nothing but a sad, desperate woman who cannot let go of the past." I looked at Marcus, then at Chloe, and finally at Aunt Vivian. They were so desperate to believe their own narrative. They needed me to be a failure so they could feel better about their own miserable transactional choices. They were practically begging the universe to confirm that I was still the broken, weeping woman they had discarded 5 years ago. I stroked Zuri's hair, marveling at how entirely wrong they were. I did not need to defend myself. I did not need to scream or cry or prove them wrong. I just needed to wait. Because the real storm was about to hit them, and they were completely unprepared for the absolute devastation it would bring to their fake, carefully constructed world. The heavy oak doors at the entrance of the grand ballroom did not just swing open this time. They were pulled back and held wide by 2 venue managers who looked absolutely terrified, standing at strict attention. The remaining murmurs in the room died instantly. The air pressure in the space seemed to shift, pulled toward the magnetic force of the man who had just stepped over the threshold. He did not strut the way Marcus did. He did not puff out his chest or scan the crowd seeking validation and attention like the rest of my family. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of an apex predator. He wore a midnight black bespoke Tom Ford suit that shifted flawlessly with his frame. There were no flashy designer logos screaming for attention, no gaudy belts or ostentatious jewelry. His wealth was woven into the impeccable tailoring of the fabric and the subtle, understated gleam of the vintage Patek Philippe watch resting on his wrist. It was the kind of stealth wealth that completely bypassed the nouveau riche and spoke directly to true, limitless power. This was Julian, my husband. The wedding guests parted like the Red Sea as he walked down the aisle. People instinctively stepped back, intimidated by his sheer presence. Marcus and Chloe remained frozen in their seats at table 14, their mocking smiles completely wiped away. Aunt Vivian looked as though she had stopped breathing altogether. Julian reached our table and his intense gaze immediately softened. He completely ignored the gaping faces of my ex-husband and my aunt. Instead, he placed a large, warm hand on the back of my chair and leaned down. "I am so sorry I am late, my love," he murmured, his deep, resonant voice wrapping around me like a protective shield. The private air traffic controllers over the city were a nightmare to clear for landing. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my lips, entirely unbothered by the audience watching us. Then he looked down at the little girl sitting happily in my lap. Zuri beamed up at him, reaching out her tiny hands. "Hey there, princess," Julian smiled, kissing her forehead. "I thought I told you to hold Mr. Davis's hand while I was taking that call in the motorcade. You cannot just run off and give your security detail a heart attack." "I missed Mommy, Zuri," stated matter-of-factly, burying her face against my neck. Julian chuckled softly, his hand resting securely on my shoulder. "I missed her too, baby." Marcus was staring at Julian with wide, panicked eyes. His mind was clearly failing to process the reality unfolding in front of him. The narrative he had sold to Chloe, to my family, and to himself was that I was a broken, lonely, destitute woman who had spent the last 5 years crying over losing him. The presence of this towering, undeniably powerful man and the beautiful child we shared shattered that delusion into a million irreparable pieces. Before Marcus could even attempt to formulate a sentence, a loud, obnoxious voice cut through the silence. "What the hell is going on over here at table 14? I looked up to see Bradley the groom strutting across the dance floor with Jasmine trailing nervously behind him. Bradley was the quintessential arrogant finance bro. He was wearing a shiny blue suit that was slightly too tight, a massive Gucci belt buckled prominently at his waist, and a Rolex that he made sure to flash with every gesture. He held a glass of expensive scotch in one hand, looking incredibly annoyed that the spotlight had shifted away from him and his bride. Aunt Vivian immediately snapped out of her shock. "Oh, Bradley, thank goodness you are here. Maya has lost her mind. She brought this child and this man into your reception without an invitation. They are completely ruining the aesthetic of your beautiful wedding." Bradley stopped at our table, puffing out his chest as he sized Julian up. Bradley was used to being the wealthiest, most important man in the room. He looked at Julian's dark, unbranded suit and clearly mistook Julian's refined subtlety for a lack of money. In Bradley's shallow world, if a man was not wearing a massive logo across his chest, he was nobody. Bradley let out a condescending scoff, swirling the scotch in his glass. "Look, buddy, I get it. Maya probably brought you in from the motor pool or whatever security firm she hired you from, so you could grab a free plate of food from the buffet. But this is a highly exclusive black tie catered event. You and the kid need to wait out in the parking lot." Julian did not react to the insult. He simply looked at Bradley with a calm, unblinking stare that made the groom visibly swallow hard. Marcus, eager to impress his new brother-in-law and boss, immediately jumped in to back Bradley up. "You heard the man. Take your shift meal and wait by the cars. Maya is just acting out because she is desperate for attention." "It is pathetic, really." Bradley smirked, clearly feeling emboldened by Marcus's support. He reached into the inner pocket of his shiny suit jacket and pulled out a thick, glossy business card. He tossed it onto the table directly in front of Julian. "Tell you what pal Bradley said," his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. "I am a senior vice president at one of the top venture capital firms in this city. We are expanding our logistics operations next quarter. I could probably pull a few strings and get you a job in our new warehouse loading boxes. It pays $18 an hour. Great benefits for a guy in your position, especially since you have a kid to feed. Take the card. Call my secretary on Monday. Now take Maya and leave my wedding reception before I have venue security physically throw you out." The entire room held its collective breath. Jasmine looked slightly embarrassed, but she did not dare correct her new husband. Aunt Vivian and Chloe were practically glowing with satisfaction, thrilled that Bradley had put us in our place. Julian looked down at the business card resting on the white tablecloth. He did not reach for it. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to establish his dominance. He slowly shifted his gaze from the card back to Bradley's flushed, arrogant face. The silence that followed was suffocatingly heavy. "I appreciate the career advice," Bradley Julian finally said. His voice was dangerously smooth, echoing clearly across the silent ballroom. "But I think you misunderstand how the financial sector actually works. I do not need a job in your warehouse. I buy companies. I do not work for them." Bradley burst into a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter. He tossed his head back, shaking his glass of scotch so aggressively that a few amber drops splashed onto the pristine dance floor. He slapped Marcus hard on the shoulder, looking at Julian as if he were a comedian performing a cheap stand-up routine. "You hear this guy?" Bradley chuckled, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "He buys companies." "Right, and I am the King of England. Next he is going to tell us he owns the building we work in." Marcus snickered, but his laugh was remarkably tense. His eyes remained fixed on Julian's impeccably tailored suit, clearly noticing the subtle, terrifying markers of real wealth that Bradley was entirely too obtuse to recognize. Before the groom could hurl another pathetic insult, Aunt Vivian decided she had seen enough. She was absolutely seething. Her daughter's $1 million wedding reception was being completely overshadowed, and she could not stand the fact that the attention of the room was focused on the niece she so deeply despised. Aunt Vivian marched right up to our table. Her face flushed a deep angry purple beneath her heavy, flawless makeup. As a prominent member of several elite social clubs, she lived for keeping up appearances, and this disruption was an unforgivable offense to her carefully curated image. "That is quite enough of this ridiculous masquerade," Aunt Vivian barked. Her voice was shrill, echoing sharply off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers of the ballroom. She pointed a trembling, diamond-clad finger directly at Julian's chest. "I do not care what kind of delusional fantasy you two are playing at today. You do not get to barge into my daughter's wedding, insult my wealthy new son-in-law, and pretend you are somebody important." Aunt Vivian planted her hands firmly on her hips, glaring down at me with unbridled disgust. The invitation sent out specifically stated one guest. One. Because quite frankly, Maya, nobody expected you to actually find a man willing to tolerate you, let alone bring a child into this venue. Jasmine finally stepped forward, clutching the heavy skirts of her massive designer wedding gown. She looked at me like I was a piece of trash that had blown in from the street. "Mom is right, Maya. This is incredibly disrespectful. You cannot just show up with extra mouths to feed." Bradley's parents paid a fortune for this entire reception, and it is incredibly embarrassing for my side of the family to look like a bunch of uneducated freeloaders. Aunt Vivian took a deep, dramatic breath, puffing out her chest as she prepared to deliver what she believed would be the ultimate crushing blow. She looked around the room, making sure the extended family and the wealthy in-laws from Bradley's side were all listening closely to her performance. "Since you decided to crash this highly exclusive event with your little entourage," Aunt Vivian continued, raising her voice even louder so the surrounding tables could hear every single word, "you are going to pay for it. The catering at this venue is $750 per plate. I demand $1,500 from you right now to cover the cost of your uninvited husband and this child. We are not running a charity kitchen for your convenience, Maya. I will not allow you to leech off the Thornton family's generosity." I did not say a word. I just sat there, gently bouncing Zuri on my knee, letting them expose their ugly, shallow souls to the entire room. Aunt Vivian mistook my absolute silence for shame. She crossed her arms, a vicious, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She was ready to completely destroy whatever dignity she thought I had left. "It is always the exact same story with you, Maya," Aunt Vivian sneered, her voice dripping with fake theatrical pity. "Always looking for a handout. I remember 5 years ago when you came crying to my front door begging for a loan to cover your hospital bills after Marcus rightfully kicked you out. You were absolutely pathetic, crying about how you were drowning in medical debt from those failed fertility treatments, how you could not afford your rent, how you had nothing left in the world." Chloe nodded eagerly from across the table, her eyes lighting up with malicious glee at the reminder of my lowest, most agonizing moment. "Oh, I remember that perfectly. She was literally blowing up Marcus's phone begging him to pay for her therapy. It was so sad to watch her beg like a dog." "Exactly," Aunt Vivian continued, emboldened by Chloe's nasty support. "I told you no back then, Maya, because pouring money into a failing investment is just bad business. And look at you now. You clearly have not learned a single lesson. You are still trying to fake a lifestyle you absolutely cannot afford. You probably dragged this poor man here promising him a free luxury dinner, and now you expect us to foot the bill. Well, it is not happening today." The silence in the grand ballroom was incredibly suffocating. The guests from Bradley's side of the family were whispering to each other, clearly shocked by the display of pure hostility, but unsure of how to intervene. My own family members either looked down at their plates or watched with twisted fascination, waiting for me to break down and cry. They desperately wanted to see me humiliated. They wanted to see me pull out a maxed-out credit card, cry over the cost, and beg for their mercy. Julian stood perfectly still next to my chair. He did not look angry. He looked utterly fascinated by the sheer audacity of the woman screaming at us. He rested his large hand gently on Zuri's head as she looked around with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, why is that lady yelling at us?" Zuri whispered, clinging to my silk dress. "She just has very bad manners. Baby Julian answered softly, kissing the top of Zuri's head. Do not worry about her. I want $1,500 in cash right now. Aunt Vivian shrieked, slamming her palm down on table 14, making the cheap silverware rattle violently against the plates. Or I am having venue security physically drag all three of you out of those front doors. I looked at Aunt Vivian, maintaining my perfectly relaxed posture. $1,500, I repeated slowly, letting the pathetic number hang in the heavy air. You are willing to cause a massive public screaming match at your only daughter's wedding reception over $1,500. It is about the principle, Maya. Aunt Vivian snapped, her face twisting into a furious scowl. It is about respect, something you clearly lack. You have always been a financial burden to this family. You have always been the weak link. Now pay up or get out. I am afraid I do not carry cash, Aunt Vivian, I said calmly. The silence lingered for what felt like an eternity. The crushing weight of the black titanium card had completely shattered the illusion of dominance my family had spent the last hour trying to build. But people like Marcus, Chloe, and Aunt Vivian do not possess the capacity for self-reflection. When faced with undeniable defeat, their fragile egos immediately scramble to construct a new, more comforting delusion. Chloe was the first to grab a lifeline. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a frantic, desperate need to rationalize what she had just witnessed. She leaned across the table, her acrylic nails digging into Marcus's expensive suit sleeve. She practically hissed into his ear, but her voice was loud enough for our entire table and the lingering groom to hear perfectly. Oh my God, Marcus, do not let her intimidate you, Chloe whispered frantically, her eyes darting between Julian and the space on the table. It is so obvious what is going on here. Look at him. He is older. He is wearing a custom suit. She is just a trophy, a pathetic little sugar baby. She probably met him on some desperate dating app for bankrupt divorcees. That card is his, not hers. He just lets her hold it to make her feel important. She is basically just a highly paid escort. The sheer level of projection was almost laughable. Chloe, a woman who had literally built her entire life by stealing her best friend's husband for financial security, was now accusing me of transactional relationships. It was a spectacular display of cognitive dissonance. Aunt Vivian snatched onto Chloe's twisted logic like a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver. The color rushed back into her heavily powdered face. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin to look down her nose at us once again. She smoothed the front of her gown, trying to recover her shattered matriarchal authority. Of course, Aunt Vivian declared, her voice regaining its shrill, grating edge. I should have known. Money does not buy class, Maya. It certainly does not buy self-respect. Flaunting another man's wealth to try and embarrass your own flesh and blood is exactly the kind of tasteless, low-class behavior I expect from you. You can wear all the unbranded silk in the world and flash your little sponsor's credit card, but you are still just the same failed, desperate woman underneath it all. Jasmine the bride nodded vigorously in agreement, wrapping both hands around Bradley's arm. It is honestly just sad, Jasmine chimed in, glaring at me. Trying to ruin my wedding day just because you are jealous of my pure traditional marriage. Bradley and I are building a real legacy together. You are just a temporary accessory to a man who probably has 3 other women just like you stashed across the city. Julian let out a low, dark chuckle. It was a rich, terrifying sound that rumbled in his chest. He looked down at me, a genuine smile playing on his lips, completely unbothered by their desperate insults. He gently stroked my arm, his thumb tracing the line of my collarbone. They have quite the active imagination, my love, Julian murmured, his voice entirely too calm for the hostility being thrown at us. I wonder how they manage to function in the business world with such a profound disconnect from reality. The mention of the business world was the exact trigger Bradley needed to reclaim his shattered ego. The groom puffed out his chest, stepping forward to re-establish his dominance as the perceived alpha male of the room. He adjusted his Gucci belt, adopting the aggressive, overconfident stance of a textbook finance bro gearing up for a pitch. Let me tell you something about the real business world, Pal Bradley sneered, pointing a finger at Julian. A fancy black credit card is just debt. It is plastic. It means absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of wealth. Real power is equity. Real power is building a corporate empire. You want to talk about reality? Let us talk about reality. Bradley raised his voice, ensuring that the surrounding tables, including his wealthy parents and their elite friends, could hear every single boastful word. Next week, Marcus and I are closing the biggest deal this city has seen in a decade, Bradley announced, practically vibrating with arrogance. Our boutique venture firm is being fully acquired. We are talking about a $500 million buyout, $500 million. Marcus and I are senior partners. When that ink dries, my commission and equity payout alone will ensure that I never have to look at a credit card bill for the rest of my natural life. Marcus immediately seized the opportunity to ride Bradley's coattails back to superiority. He sat up straighter, the color returning to his face. He adjusted his tie, looking at me with renewed vicious confidence. "That is right," Marcus smirked, his eyes gleaming with greed. 500 million. And we are not just selling to anyone. We are being acquired by Apex Capital. Bradley nodded enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the sudden predatory gleam that flashed in Julian's eyes. Apex Capital, Bradley repeated, making sure everyone heard the name. They are an absolute juggernaut, a ghost conglomerate that has been aggressively buying up every profitable logistics and tech firm on the eastern seaboard. Nobody even knows who the chief executive officer is. The founder is a total phantom, a ruthless billionaire who operates entirely from the shadows. But their mergers and acquisitions team has been courting us for 6 months. We passed their due diligence with flying colors. We are the crown jewel of their new portfolio. Marcus leaned across the table, planting his hands firmly on the white linen, trying to loom over me. "So go ahead and enjoy your free meal on your sugar daddy's dime, Maya," Marcus sneered. "Because by this time next week, Chloe and I will be sitting on an 8-figure payout. I will have a seat on the executive board of an Apex subsidiary, and you will still be nothing but a sad, bitter memory. You think flashing a credit card hurts me? I am about to be untouchable." Chloe clapped her hands together, letting out a squeal of delight. "Oh, Marcus, it is going to be so perfect. We need to upgrade our flights to Dubai for the honeymoon to first class to celebrate. We can finally buy that yacht you were looking at." Aunt Vivian looked absolutely triumphant. She placed a hand over her heart, beaming at Marcus and Bradley as if they were conquering heroes. "Now that is what real success looks like," Aunt Vivian declared loudly. "That is what hard work and pedigree bring you, not cheap stunts and rented dates. Jasmine, my darling, you married a true visionary, and Chloe, you certainly traded up when you married Marcus." I sat there perfectly composed, listening to them build their magnificent, towering house of cards. They were so incredibly proud of themselves. They were entirely intoxicated by the sound of their own voices, blinded by the fantasy of their impending $500 million payday. They were bragging about Apex Capital with such religious reverence, treating the name like a golden ticket to immortality. They had absolutely no idea. They had no idea that the ruthless phantom billionaire they were practically worshipping was sitting less than 3 feet away from them, holding a glass of cheap wedding champagne. I glanced up at Julian. His face was a mask of perfect icy neutrality, but his eyes were dancing with lethal anticipation. We did not need to say a single word to each other. The trap was fully set. They had walked right into it, locked the door behind themselves, and handed me the key. All I had to do now was press the button and watch their entire universe burn to the ground. Bradley raised his glass of scotch high into the air, completely unaware that he was standing squarely on the trapdoor of his own execution. He loudly invited the surrounding tables to join him in a toast to Apex Capital, the invisible giant that was about to make him a king. Marcus eagerly raised his own glass, clinking it against Bradley's with a sickeningly triumphant grin. Chloe practically shrieked with delight, already calculating which designer boutiques she would empty by next Tuesday. Aunt Vivian beamed radiantly, looking around the grand ballroom to ensure every single guest from the groom's affluent white family was paying close attention to her son-in-law's magnificent success. I just sat there, my posture perfectly relaxed, watching them celebrate their impending doom. Zuri was quietly playing with a silver napkin ring, completely oblivious to the financial slaughter that was about to unfold at table 14. Bradley's knees finally gave out entirely. He collapsed into the nearest empty chair at our table, his face buried in his hands, his breath coming in short, erratic, panic-stricken gasps. His entire life, his career, his $500 million fantasy payout, all of it had just been completely incinerated by the woman he had just offered an $18 an hour warehouse job to. Marcus was shaking. His hands trembled so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to keep himself upright. He stared at the leather dossier, at the engraved Apex Capital logo on the flash drive, and then finally up at my face. The absolute, unadulterated terror in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. "You," Marcus choked out, his voice a pathetic, ragged whisper. "That is impossible. You are lying. You cannot be Apex. You are a nobody. You have nothing. I left you with nothing." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout. "You left me in a hospital bed with a shattered heart and a mountain of medical debt." "Marcus," I said, my voice dripping with pure, concentrated ice. "You walked out on our marriage because you thought I was broken. You thought I was a failure because my body could not give you a child right away, and you wanted to play house with my best friend. You assumed I would just curl up and die without you." I watched him swallow hard, his throat bobbing, as the reality of his monumental mistake began to set in. But I did not die. I continued, my gaze pinning him to his chair. I survived. I took every ounce of pain, every single ounce of betrayal you and Chloe inflicted on me, and I used it. I worked 20 hours a day. I built a private equity firm from the ground up out of a tiny studio apartment while you two were busy spending your credit limits to look rich on social media. I am not just a partner at Apex Capital, Marcus. I am the sole founder. I am the chief executive officer. And as of 60 seconds ago, I am officially your new boss. And you are officially unemployed." Aunt Vivian let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. She clutched her chest, her elaborate hat tilting precariously as she staggered backward. The realization that she had just spent 20 minutes screaming at, insulting, and demanding a $1,500 catering fee from a billionaire was actively destroying her brain. Chloe's face was a mask of pure horror. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth, her oversized diamond ring suddenly looking incredibly cheap and ridiculous. She looked at Marcus, waiting for him to fix it, waiting for him to assert his dominance and prove that this was all a lie. But Marcus was completely broken. He knew the acquisition was real. He knew the corporate codes and the legal terminology Harrison had used could not be faked. "But wait," Bradley stammered, raising his head from his hands. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and frantic. "The building. Horizon Ventures has a 10-year ironclad lease at the Sterling Tower. You cannot just lock us out. We have tenant rights. We will sue you. My father has the best corporate lawyers in the city. You cannot legally evict a corporate headquarters overnight." Julian finally moved. He reached out and gently picked up his phone, slipping it back into his tailored jacket. He looked down at Bradley with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "You really are incredibly dense, Bradley," Julian said, his deep voice slicing through the groom's frantic threats. "You clearly did not read your own commercial lease agreement very carefully. If you had, you would have noticed the primary ownership structure of your corporate headquarters." Julian adjusted his cuffs, his posture projecting the undeniable authority of a man who owned the very ground they walked on. "The Sterling Tower is not just a name," Julian stated smoothly. "It is my name. I own the building. I own the management company that leases your floors. I own the security firm that guards the lobby. Your 10-year lease contains a standard corporate acquisition clause, allowing the landlord to terminate the agreement immediately upon a change of controlling ownership. Since my wife just bought your company, your lease is officially null and void." Bradley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The last remaining pillar of his fake, arrogant world had just been systematically kicked out from under him. "So, yes," Julian continued, stepping closer to my chair and placing his hand firmly on my shoulder. "I can absolutely lock you out. My security teams are currently reprogramming the elevator access cards. Your badges will be deactivated by midnight. If you try to enter the building on Monday, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing. I looked at the four of them: Marcus, Chloe, Bradley, and Aunt Vivian. They looked like they had just survived a plane crash. Their designer clothes, their fake jewelry, their country club attitudes, all of it had been completely incinerated by the brutal, undeniable reality of true wealth and absolute power. They had tried to bury me in the dark, completely unaware that I had spent the last 5 years becoming the fire. Bradley's breathing turned ragged and uneven. He shook his head violently from side to side, actively refusing to accept the catastrophic reality that had just been handed to him on a silver platter. He stumbled backward, his shiny, expensive dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor of the ballroom. He pulled his smartphone from his inner pocket with trembling fingers, nearly dropping the device before managing to grip it tightly. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger at Julian and me. "This is fake," Bradley gasped, his voice cracking loudly. "This is a highly coordinated, pathetic bluff. I am calling Richard right now." Richard is the acting chief executive officer of Horizon Ventures. He has been negotiating directly with the Apex board for the last 6 months. He will tell me exactly what is going on, and he will confirm that you are completely full of it. Bradley turned aggressively and shoved his way through the dense crowd of celebrating wedding guests. He sought a quiet, secluded corner near the catering exit, keeping his phone pressed tightly against his ear. The rest of the grand ballroom was completely oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated at our table. The string quartet had resumed playing a cheerful, upbeat melody. Waiters in crisp white uniforms were seamlessly serving plates of expensive food. The blissful ignorance of the surrounding crowd created a beautiful, poetic contrast to the absolute misery suffocating table 14. Marcus watched Bradley walk away, a pathetic, desperate glimmer of hope still clinging to his sweaty features. Marcus desperately needed his arrogant new brother-in-law to come back and declare this entire corporate execution a massive, elaborate hoax. Chloe mirrored her husband's terrified expression, her long acrylic nails tapping a frantic, irregular rhythm against the white linen tablecloth. Aunt Vivian stood entirely rigid, her eyes darting nervously around the ballroom. She was absolutely terrified that her wealthy elite new-in-laws sitting at the head table had overheard the devastating financial ruin that had just been pronounced over her daughter's new husband. The wait was agonizing for them, but it was pure, unadulterated entertainment for me. I casually picked up a heavy silver fork and tapped it lightly against the crystal rim of my water glass, letting the crisp, clear chime ring out over the unbearable tension. Jasmine looked like she was on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. She clutched the heavy, expensive tulle of her bridal gown, her knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. "Mom?" Jasmine whispered, her voice wavering with rising panic. "What is happening right now? Is Bradley really losing his job? Is he really broke?" Aunt Vivian could not form a coherent response. She just stared at me as if I had suddenly grown horns and fangs. I glanced at Marcus. He was sweating profusely now. Large, heavy beads of perspiration gathered on his forehead, completely ruining his perfectly groomed, wealthy executive appearance. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked incredibly restrictive, as if the collar of his shirt were actively strangling him. Julian remained standing perfectly still by my side. He was a silent, immovable force of absolute authority. He simply observed the burning wreckage of their fragile egos with a mild analytical interest. He did not need to gloat or raise his voice. The brutal, undeniable reality of our combined net worth was doing all the necessary heavy damage. From across the crowded room, I could see Bradley pacing frantically back and forth near the kitchen doors. He had one finger pressed tightly against his other ear to block out the cheerful wedding music. He was nodding rapidly, his mouth moving in a flurry of desperate, panicked questions. Then he simply stopped. His entire body went completely rigid, as if he had been struck by lightning. Even from 50 feet away across a sea of dancing guests, I could see the exact horrifying second his chief executive officer confirmed the truth. Bradley's broad shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. The hand holding his phone dropped limply to his side, the device dangling from his loose grip. He stood there for a long, painful minute, staring blankly at the elaborate floral centerpieces arranged along the walls. The illusion of his immense wealth, his untouchable corporate status, and his elite financial pedigree had officially died. He slowly turned around and began the long, agonizing walk back to our table. He looked exactly like a condemned man walking straight to the executioner's block. His confident finance bro swagger was entirely gone. He dragged his feet, his posture hunched forward, his face completely devoid of any natural color. He looked like a hollow, terrified shell of a human being. Bradley reached table 14 and collapsed heavily into his chair. He did not look at his new bride. He did not look at his wealthy, socially prominent parents sitting just a few tables away. He looked directly at Marcus. Marcus leaned forward instantly, his voice a frantic, desperate, pleading whisper. "Tell me she is lying, Brad. Tell me Richard said this is a complete hoax. Tell me we are still getting our equity payout next week. Tell me my shares are secure." Bradley slowly shook his head. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. "Richard is packing his office into boxes right now," Bradley replied, his voice completely dead, carrying a hollow, defeated echo. "The deal just closed. Apex Capital owns absolutely everything." Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing her hands against her mouth. "I asked Richard who the buyer was." Bradley continued, his eyes wide and vacant. "I asked him who was sitting at the very top of the acquiring board. I asked him who authorized the liquidation of our entire division." Bradley finally turned his head to look at me. His eyes were filled with absolute, paralyzing dread. He looked at me as if I held the power of life and death, which in his shallow, money-driven world I absolutely did. "Richard said the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital is a black woman named Maya Sterling." Bradley said, his voice shaking violently. He took a ragged, shallow breath, running a trembling hand through his carefully styled hair. "We are fired, Marcus. Our shares are totally voided. The new security protocols are already active. Richard said we are legally barred from entering the Sterling Tower on Monday morning. It is over. We lost everything." The words hung in the air, a definitive, crushing verdict. The $500 million fantasy was dead, and I was the one holding the smoking gun. The crushing weight of Bradley's confirmation hung over table 14 like a thick, suffocating fog. The reality of my immense wealth and absolute power had finally penetrated their thick, arrogant skulls. I watched the profound psychological shift happen in real time. It was a fascinating display of human desperation. Bradley and Aunt Vivian were fundamentally transactional creatures. Their entire world revolved around money, status, and proximity to power. Now that they understood I possessed more power than anyone else in the room, their basic survival instincts brutally overrode their fragile egos. The hostility vanished instantly, replaced by a sickening, desperate need to please me. They realized they were dealing with a billionaire who held their entire future in her hands, and their immediate reaction was to grovel. Bradley was the first to attempt the massive pivot. He forced a wide, strained smile onto his pale face, showing all of his teeth in a grimace that looked physically painful. He let out a loud, artificial laugh, waving his hands in the air, as if attempting to magically erase the last 30 minutes of conversation. "Maya, Julian, listen to me," Bradley stammered, his voice dripping with sudden, unnatural warmth. "This is all just a massive misunderstanding. The stuff I said earlier about the warehouse job and the insults, that was just classic finance bro banter. You know how it is in the industry. We break each other's chops. It is how we test the mettle of the people we do business with. I had no idea you two were the visionaries behind Apex Capital. I have been following your acquisition strategies for months. You guys are absolute legends in the sector." Julian did not offer a single word of response. He simply continued to look at Bradley with the same detached clinical disgust one might reserve for a cockroach crawling across a dining table. Bradley swallowed hard, sweating profusely, but he pressed on, driven by the sheer terror of losing his impending fortune and his elite career. "We are all family here now," Bradley continued, gesturing frantically between Jasmine and myself. Jasmine is your cousin. I am your new cousin-in-law. We should be celebrating this merger, not fighting over corporate restructuring details. We can create incredible synergy together. With my insider knowledge of Horizon Ventures and your capital, we can easily double the projected valuation by next quarter. You need a guy like me on the inside to smooth the transition. We should be popping expensive bottles and discussing executive strategy. In fact, you two should not be sitting back here by the kitchen doors. This is completely unacceptable for a chief executive officer and a prominent real estate magnate. Aunt Vivian seamlessly caught the lifeline Bradley had thrown out. She snapped her fingers, her face transforming into a mask of exaggerated, overwhelming maternal affection. She completely abandoned her previous narrative of me being a destitute, shameful burden. She stepped forward and actually tried to reach out and touch my arm, but a sharp warning glance from Mr. Davis made her yank her hand back instantly. Bradley is absolutely right. Aunt Vivian cooed, her voice so dripping with fake sweetness, it was practically a biohazard. Maya, my darling, beautiful niece, I am so incredibly sorry for the mix-up with the seating chart. The catering staff at this venue has been completely incompetent all evening. They must have swapped your name card by mistake. I would never intentionally place my favorite sister's daughter at a table like this. It is far too drafty, and you look so elegant tonight. That custom silk dress is simply breathtaking. I was just telling Jasmine how much you have blossomed since the divorce. Aunt Vivian turned her vicious glare toward Marcus and Chloe, throwing them under the bus without a single second of hesitation. Marcus and Chloe were no longer useful to her. They were fired, broke, and toxic. Aunt Vivian expertly distanced herself from the sinking ship, eager to sacrifice them to save her daughter's new husband. I cannot believe the horrible, nasty things these two have been saying to you, Aunt Vivian hissed, pointing a manicured finger at Marcus and Chloe. They have been antagonizing you all evening, and I simply will not tolerate that kind of negativity at my daughter's wedding. Marcus, you should be deeply ashamed of yourself for speaking to a highly successful woman like Maya in that tone. Maya, please you. And Julian must get up right now. We have 2 empty chairs at the VIP head table right next to Bradley's parents. They are the owners of the largest private medical supply company in the state. You will absolutely love them. We can introduce you properly, order the premium vintage champagne, and celebrate this beautiful family union. You belong at the front of the room with the real elite, darling. Come with me. They stood there leaning toward me with desperate, pleading eyes, waiting for me to accept their pathetic offering. They actually believed that a seat at their generic rented head table would be enough to buy my mercy. They thought that appealing to my supposed desire for high society validation would erase the fact that they had just tried to strip me of my basic human dignity. They assumed I was still the same insecure woman who craved their approval and wanted nothing more than to be included in their shallow, materialistic world. I looked at the VIP head table across the ballroom. I saw Bradley's wealthy, oblivious parents laughing and clinking glasses, completely unaware that their son had just been fired and stripped of his financial future. Then I looked back at Aunt Vivian's desperate, sweating face and Bradley's terrified, pleading eyes. I gently adjusted Zuri's silk ribbon, ensuring my daughter was perfectly comfortable on my lap. I leaned back into the solid, comforting warmth of Julian's chest. I did not need their validation. I did not need to sit at their head table to prove my worth. I owned the company that owned them. I owned the building they worked in. I offered them a slow, razor-sharp smile. Table 14 suits you perfectly, I said, my voice cutting through their fake sweetness like a scalpel. I prefer watching the circus from here. The sheer finality of my words struck them like a physical blow. Bradley's fake, eager smile completely collapsed, revealing the absolute panic boiling just beneath the surface. He took a stumbling step backward, realizing that his cheap attempt at corporate networking had failed miserably. Aunt Vivian's outstretched hand dropped limply to her side. The sickeningly sweet expression melted off her face, replaced by a look of profound, dawning horror. They had played all their cards, exhausted all their leverage, and deployed every manipulative tactic in their shallow arsenal. None of it had worked. I was not going to move to their head table. I was not going to save Bradley's job. I was not going to play the role of the forgiving, compliant family member. I was going to sit right here at the back of the room near the kitchen doors, and I was going to watch them face the brutal consequences of their own actions. The performance they had put on for the last hour had reached its spectacular conclusion, and the final curtain was coming down really fast. Marcus watched Bradley completely fail and realized that his arrogant new brother-in-law was not going to magically save him from imminent financial ruin. The final undeniable reality of his situation finally snapped the last remaining thread of Marcus's sanity. He stumbled forward, knocking his own chair backward. The heavy wooden chair hit the floor with a loud crack, but Marcus did not even flinch. He gripped the edge of table 14, his knuckles turning stark white as he leaned over the white linen. He rapidly lowered his voice instantly, dropping the aggressive corporate executive persona and adopting the soft, pleading tone he used to use whenever he wanted to manipulate me during our marriage. "Maya, please." Marcus begged, his voice cracking with raw, desperate emotion. "You cannot do this to me. We were married for 7 years. We built an entire life together. You know exactly how hard I worked to get this promotion. You know what this buyout means for my entire future. You cannot just erase my career with one phone call. I know I made terrible mistakes. I know I hurt you. But deep down, you know I always cared about you. We have history. You are a good person, Maya. You are not vindictive. Please, I am begging you, do not take my livelihood away." I looked at the man I had once vowed to spend the rest of my life with. I searched his sweating, terrified face for even a single ounce of genuine remorse. There was absolutely none. He was not sorry for abandoning me. He was not sorry for breaking my heart or parading his infidelity in my face at a family wedding. He was only sorry that the woman he so casually discarded had suddenly become the one holding the keys to his absolute financial survival. "Our history is exactly why I am doing this, Marcus," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any warmth. "You did not just make a mistake. You made a calculated, vicious decision to abandon your wife while she was bleeding in a hospital bed. You decided that my physical and emotional grief was simply too inconvenient for your upwardly mobile lifestyle. You stole our shared savings to fund your secret extravagant vacations with my best friend. You left me drowning in overwhelming medical debt while you bought her diamonds. You did not care if I survived the night. So do not stand there and try to weaponize our dead marriage to save your bank account." Horizon Ventures was a highly distressed asset. Your specific venture division has been bleeding capital for months due to your reckless investment strategies and gross executive mismanagement. Apex Capital did not acquire your firm to keep you comfortably employed. We acquired it strictly for the underlying logistical infrastructure and your client database. I stood up slowly, ensuring I was looking down at both Marcus and Bradley. "I am officially liquidating your entire department. Every single project you currently manage is being shut down permanently." Bradley, "Your corporate commissions are entirely voided. Marcus, your executive severance package is completely nullified under the gross misconduct clauses our legal team uncovered during the corporate audit. You are not getting a massive equity payout. You are not getting a comfortable seat on the subsidiary board. You are both officially fired effective immediately." Bradley let out a pathetic whimpering sound, sinking much lower into his chair. His wealthy parents, who had finally made their way over from the VIP table after noticing the massive commotion at the back of the room, arrived just in time to hear the definitive execution of their son's entire career. His mother gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace in absolute horror, while his father turned a dark, furious shade of red, realizing his arrogant son had just publicly insulted a billionaire who now owned their family's primary source of wealth. "You cannot take my shares," Marcus pleaded, tears actually welling up in his eyes as his voice broke. He reached out his hands as if to grab my arm in a desperate plea for salvation, but Julian smoothly stepped forward, He positioned his massive frame directly between Marcus and my chair. Marcus immediately recoiled, terrified of the silent, imposing billionaire standing guard. Your corporate shares were legally contingent on your continued employment in good standing. Julian explained, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. Since you have been terminated for cause, those shares automatically revert back to the parent company. You own absolutely nothing. I strongly suggest you back away from my wife right now before I have my personal security team escort you out of this venue by force. Marcus stared at Julian, then at me. He was completely and utterly destroyed. The arrogant, boastful executive who had smirked at me just an hour ago was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified man who had just realized he had to go home and figure out how to pay for a millionaire lifestyle with absolutely zero income. I picked up my clutch and Zuri's small sweater, my movements smooth and completely unbothered. The corporate execution was flawless, final, and complete. The physical collapse of Bradley Vance was immediately followed by the arrival of his parents. William and Eleanor Vance pushed their way through the murmuring crowd of wedding guests. They were the epitome of old money elitism. William wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo with a posture that screamed generational wealth. Eleanor was draped in authentic pearls and an icy glare that she usually reserved for the service staff. They had noticed the commotion from the VIP head table and marched over to table 14 to demand an explanation for their son's pathetic display. "What on earth is going on here?" Eleanor demanded. Her voice was sharp and entirely devoid of any warmth. "Bradley, get off the floor this instant. You are making an absolute spectacle of yourself in front of our friends. Stand up and act like a Vance." Bradley could not stand up. He looked up at his mother with completely vacant, tear-filled eyes. "Mom, it is gone," Bradley choked out. "The acquisition went through, but they stripped my equity. I am fired. Marcus is fired. We lost the $500 million payout. We have absolutely nothing." William Vance froze. The color drained from his ruddy, aristocratic face. He looked at Marcus, who was still gripping the edge of the table like a drowning man, and then he looked directly at me. William was a seasoned corporate shark. He saw the black titanium flash drive. He saw the American Express Centurion card. He looked at Julian's terrifyingly calm demeanor, and then at my unwavering, icy stare. William put the pieces together faster than his incompetent son ever could. "You are Apex Capital," William stated. It was not a question. It was a horrifying realization. I replied smoothly. "And your son just spent the last 20 minutes insulting my husband, mocking my appearance, and boasting about a company I now entirely own. So I liquidated his career." Eleanor Vance gasped loudly, pressing a hand against her pearls. She turned her furious Arctic glare away from me and aimed it directly at Aunt Vivian like a loaded shotgun. Aunt Vivian was physically trembling. The elite wealthy white in-laws she had worshipped and bent over backward to impress for the last 2 years were now looking at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Is this the respectable high-class family you promised us?" Vivian Eleanor hissed. Her voice was dripping with venom. "You spent months sitting in my country club bragging about your impeccable pedigree and your elite social circles. You assured us that our son was marrying into a family of equal standing, and yet I just watched you scream at your own niece like a fishwife. I watched you demand a petty $1,500 catering fee from a woman who could buy and sell our entire family portfolio before breakfast. You are an absolute embarrassment." Aunt Vivian stepped forward, her hands raised in a desperate pleading gesture. "Eleanor, William, please listen to me. This is just a massive misunderstanding. Maya has always been a difficult child. She hid this from us. We had no idea she was involved with Apex. If we had known, we would have treated her with the utmost respect." William let out a harsh, barking laugh that completely shattered Aunt Vivian's remaining dignity. "That makes it infinitely worse, you foolish woman," William snapped. "You only treat people with respect when you know they have money. You publicly humiliated the most powerful financial player in the room because you thought she was poor. Your complete lack of basic intelligence just cost my son his entire future." We spent over $700,000 funding this ridiculous over-the-top wedding because you swore your family had invaluable connections. We tolerated your tacky demands and your desperate social climbing because Bradley claimed this marriage would solidify his executive image. Jasmine let out a loud, heartbroken sob. She clutched her custom bridal gown, tears ruining her flawless, incredibly expensive makeup. Bradley, what is your father talking about? Jasmine cried. You told me you loved me. You told me this wedding was about us. Bradley did not even look at his new wife. He just stared blankly at the floor, completely broken. Oh, grow up, Jasmine. Eleanor snapped, turning her vicious elitism onto the bride without a single ounce of mercy. Do not play the naive victim. We all know exactly why you married my son. You wanted the Vance family name. You wanted the generational wealth and the unlimited black cards. You wanted the luxury properties in the Hamptons and the guaranteed seat at the charity galas. And Bradley wanted a beautiful, diverse trophy wife to make him look progressive and grounded to his corporate board. It was a transaction. It was a mutually beneficial business arrangement, but now look at this disaster. This. Eleanor swept her hand toward her son in a gesture of absolute contempt. Now my son is unemployed, stripped of his equity, and globally blacklisted by the most powerful private equity firm on the East Coast. Your transaction just went bankrupt, Jasmine. You married a man who currently has absolutely zero income and avoided corporate lease. I hope you kept the tags on that tacky wedding dress because you are going to need the refund. Aunt Vivian let out a strangled, horrified wail. She looked around the grand ballroom. The elite guests from the Vance family side were already standing up from their tables. They were whispering furiously, gathering their coats and expensive evening bags. The wedding reception had completely dissolved into a toxic, humiliating nightmare. The high society status Aunt Vivian had sacrificed her own niece to secure was actively burning to ash. You cannot speak to us this way, Aunt Vivian pleaded, tears of pure panic streaming down her face. We are family now. We are bound by marriage. We have to present a united front. We are absolutely nothing of the sort, William Vance growled. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket with sharp, angry movements. We are leaving. I will not spend another second associating with a family of financially illiterate, socially desperate clowns. Bradley, if you have a single shred of dignity left, you will annul this fraudulent marriage by Monday morning. Do not expect us to bail you out of this mess. You dug your own grave when you insulted the CEO of Apex Capital. Now lie in it. William and Eleanor Vance turned their backs on their son and marched straight out of the grand ballroom. They did not look back. They led a mass exodus of the wealthy elite guests they had invited. The room began to empty rapidly, leaving table 14 completely isolated in a sea of abandoned, half-eaten luxury meals and half-empty champagne glasses. Jasmine fell to her knees right there on the dance floor, weeping hysterically into her hands. Her perfect multi-million-dollar fairy tale had transformed into a brutal, humiliating divorce before she had even cut the wedding cake. Aunt Vivian dropped into a nearby chair, clutching her chest as she hyperventilated, her entire social reality thoroughly destroyed. The sheer ruthless speed of their downfall was breathtaking. I sat perfectly still, observing the devastation with absolute tranquility. I did not feel a single drop of pity. They had built their entire universe on lies, greed, and the deliberate destruction of others. The collapse was entirely their own doing. The mass exodus of the Vance family left a gaping vacuum in the grand ballroom. The luxurious space suddenly felt incredibly hollow, filled only by the sound of Jasmine weeping uncontrollably on the polished dance floor. Aunt Vivian stared at the heavy oak doors where her wealthy in-laws had just vanished. Her chest heaved rapidly as her brain struggled to comprehend that her ultimate social triumph had just evaporated into nothing. She slowly turned her head toward table 14. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch was completely gone. In her place stood a frantic, desperate woman who realized her only remaining lifeline was the niece she had spent the entire evening treating like absolute garbage. Aunt Vivian pushed herself up from the chair. Her knees trembled so violently she nearly collapsed again. She stumbled toward me, her hands outstretched in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. All of her country club pride had been entirely stripped away by the sheer terror of social and financial ruin. "Maya, please!" Aunt Vivian begged, her voice cracking loudly. The shrill, commanding tone was entirely replaced by a desperate, wet plea. "You have to fix this right now. You have to call William back. Tell him you will reinstate Bradley at the firm. Tell him you will give Marcus his shares back. You cannot let them do this to Jasmine. She is your blood. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water, Maya. You cannot just destroy your own cousin's wedding day and walk away. We are family, and family protects each other. We stick together when things get difficult." I looked down at her outstretched hands. I did not move. I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. Julian stood right behind me, an immovable wall of silent support, completely unbothered by her frantic tears. I let her desperate words hang in the heavy air, allowing the few remaining guests and extended family members who had lingered to hear her pathetic hypocrisy. She was actually trying to weaponize the concept of family loyalty after spending the last 5 years demonstrating she had absolutely none. "Blood is thicker than water," I repeated slowly, tasting the absolute absurdity of the phrase on my tongue. "That is a truly fascinating choice of words, Aunt Vivian, because I seem to recall a very specific time when my blood was literally pouring out of me, and you were nowhere to be found. In fact, you were actively protecting the exact people who were causing it." The color that had rushed to Aunt Vivian's face during her desperate plea instantly vanished, leaving her looking sickly and gray. Her jaw dropped open and she took a sudden, terrified step backward. She knew exactly what I was about to say. She raised a shaking hand, desperately trying to silence me, but the time for silence was long gone. "Let us take a quick trip down memory lane," I announced, projecting my voice so that every single person remaining in the grand ballroom could hear the absolute horrifying truth. 5 years ago, I was lying in a sterile hospital bed. I was losing my baby. I was bleeding, terrified, and completely alone in a cold trauma ward. I was calling my husband repeatedly, but his phone went straight to voicemail. In my sheer panic, I called you, Aunt Vivian. I called my own flesh and blood, begging for someone to come hold my hand while I suffered the most agonizing physical and emotional pain a woman could ever endure. Jasmine stopped crying. She looked up from the floor, her tear-streaked face frozen in deep confusion. Chloe shrank back into her chair, trying to make herself as small as humanly possible, her face contorted with guilt and terror. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, entirely unable to look at anyone. I kept my gaze locked onto Aunt Vivian, watching sheer terror consume her perfectly powdered features. "You answered the phone that morning, Aunt Vivian?" I continued, my voice sharp and utterly unyielding. "And you were not at a country club. You were not at a charity meeting. You were at Chloe's apartment. You had gone over there for a morning mimosa brunch, and you knew exactly where Marcus was because his car was parked right outside her bedroom window. You knew my husband was in my best friend's bed while I was miscarrying his child." The remaining guests let out a collective, horrified gasp. The absolute depravity of the secret hit the room like a physical shockwave. Aunts and uncles who had previously judged me for my divorce were now staring at Vivian with their mouths open in pure disgust. Aunt Vivian shook her head frantically, tears of pure shame welling in her eyes, but she could not utter a single word of denial. "And what did you tell me, Aunt Vivian?" I demanded, standing up from my chair to tower over her shrinking form. "When I told you I was losing the baby, what were your exact words to your beloved niece? You did not rush to the hospital to comfort me. You did not condemn Marcus or Chloe for their vile betrayal. You told me to stop being dramatic. You told me that men naturally stray when their wives fail to perform their biological duties. You told me to just accept it, dry my tears, and figure out how to be a better wife so he would not have to look elsewhere." Aunt Vivian let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. She covered her face with her shaking hands, entirely unable to bear the disgusted stares of her own relatives. She had always styled herself as the strict moral compass of the family, the ultimate enforcer of traditional values and religious piety. Now she was exposed as a vile, heartless enabler who had facilitated the destruction of her own niece's marriage simply to protect her social standing with Marcus's lucrative venture capital firm. So do not ever stand there and preach to me about blood being thicker than water, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality. You define family based entirely on net worth and social convenience. You protected Marcus and Chloe because you thought Marcus was going to be a wealthy executive who could fund Jasmine's luxurious lifestyle. You threw me away because you thought I was a broken, useless liability. You made a calculated business decision 5 years ago, Aunt Vivian. And now you are simply experiencing the horrific return on your investment. I turned my back on her weeping, crumpled figure. She was completely broken, her reputation entirely incinerated, her daughter's marriage destroyed, and her social standing reduced to absolute ash. There was no recovery from a public exposure of that magnitude. She would be a total pariah in her elite social clubs by Monday morning. I had stripped away the fake glamorous mask she had worn for decades, revealing the rotting hypocritical core underneath, and I did not feel a single drop of remorse for doing it. Her ultimate destruction was thoroughly deserved. The heavy silence that followed my revelation did not last long. It fractured, splintering into a rising tide of furious murmurs that quickly escalated into outright vocal contempt. The remaining guests in the grand ballroom, our extended relatives, the influential church elders, and the few elite socialites who had stayed behind to watch the drama unfold, were now looking at Aunt Vivian as if she were a carrier of a highly contagious disease. In the affluent, image-obsessed circles of Atlanta's high society, discretion was everything. But Vivian had not just been indiscreet. She had been exceptionally cruel, actively facilitating the destruction of her own niece during a medical emergency. That was a line no amount of designer clothing or country club memberships could ever cover up. I watched as Uncle Robert, a respected senior deacon who had known our family for 30 years, stood up from his table. He picked up his suit jacket, his face set in a deep, judgmental scowl. He did not even look at Vivian as he walked past her. He simply shook his head in pure disgust and headed straight for the exit. That single action broke the dam. Entire tables began to empty. People were literally scraping their chairs backward, desperate to put as much physical distance between themselves and my aunt as possible. The social exile was immediate, brutal, and completely irreversible. Vivian had spent her entire life stepping on others to climb the social ladder, and now she was tumbling all the way to the bottom, watching her peers actively turn their backs on her. While Vivian sat paralyzed in a puddle of her own shattered pride, the reality of the financial apocalypse was finally detonating inside Chloe's brain. The initial shock of Marcus losing his job had been overshadowed by the sheer horror of my medical revelation. But now, with the room emptying and the elite crowd vanishing, Chloe realized the true terrifying scope of her impending doom. The glamorous, wealthy lifestyle she had stolen from me was completely evaporating into thin air. Chloe abruptly pushed her chair back, the harsh scraping sound cutting through the ambient noise of the departing guests. She rounded on Marcus, her perfectly contoured face contorting into a mask of hysterical, absolute panic. "Marcus! What are we going to do?" Chloe shrieked, grabbing him by the lapels of his ruined, sweat-soaked suit. Her voice was shrill and frantic, completely devoid of the fake, polished elegance she had been projecting all evening. "You cannot just sit there. Do you understand what is happening right now? The closing on the new house is on Tuesday. We put down a non-refundable $300,000 deposit. If the bank runs a final employment verification check and sees you were terminated for gross misconduct, they will pull the mortgage instantly. We will lose the deposit, we will lose the house." Marcus tried to pull away from her frantic grip, but Chloe dug her acrylic nails deeper into his jacket fabric. She was completely unraveling, spiraling into a total meltdown. "And the cars!" Chloe sobbed, her voice rising an octave higher. "The lease payments on the Range Rover and the Porsche are due next week. We maxed out the platinum cards to pay for the yacht deposit and the Dubai tickets. We have absolutely zero liquid cash. You told me the buyout was guaranteed. You promised me we were going to be worth 8 figures by Friday. You promised me I would never have to worry about a price tag again." The pure, unadulterated transaction of their marriage was on full display for everyone to witness. There was no love, no loyalty, no vows to uphold. Chloe did not care that Marcus had just suffered a catastrophic career failure. She did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. She was only terrified that her status as a wealthy executive's wife had just been violently revoked. She was looking at Marcus not as a husband, but as a broken automated teller machine that had just swallowed her debit card. Marcus finally snapped. The sheer humiliation of being berated by his wife in front of his billionaire ex-wife and the remaining wedding guests broke whatever fragile restraint he had left. He violently shoved Chloe's hands off his chest, his face twisting into a furious, ugly scowl. "Do you think I do not know that?" Chloe Marcus roared, his voice cracking with pure rage and desperation. "Do you think I do not know we are completely bankrupt? This is your fault just as much as mine. You are the one who demanded the custom-built mansion in the suburbs. You are the one who insisted we lease 2 luxury cars we could barely afford just so you could flex on your friends on social media. I begged you to wait until the acquisition closed, but you had to have the yacht right now. You bled my bank accounts dry to fund your ridiculous fake lifestyle, and now you have the nerve to stand here and scream at me because the gravy train just derailed." Chloe staggered backward as if she had been physically struck. Her jaw dropped open in sheer outrage. "How dare you blame me?" she screamed back, tears of pure fury streaming down her face. "I gave you the best years of my life. I stood by you when you were just a mid-level manager. You promised me an empire, Marcus. You told me Maya was holding you back. You said she was too obsessed with her little startup to be a real wife, and that with me by your side you would conquer the financial world. And look at where we are. She is the billionaire CEO who just bought your entire company, and you are a jobless, pathetic failure who cannot even pay his car lease." They tore into each other like starving wolves fighting over a scrap of meat. It was a vicious, deeply ugly spectacle. They were airing out all their toxic, buried resentments, throwing every single financial and emotional failure into each other's faces. The remaining guests paused by the doors, watching the absolute destruction of a marriage that had been built on a foundation of betrayal and deceit. I stood there, wrapped in the secure, unshakable presence of my husband. Julian rested his large hand on the small of my back, a silent, grounding anchor in the middle of the storm. I watched Marcus and Chloe scream at each other, their faces red and twisted with hate, and I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. 5 years ago, I thought losing Marcus was the end of my world. I had cried until my eyes were swollen shut, wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why I was not enough for him. Now, looking at the pathetic, miserable reality of their relationship, I realized that losing Marcus was the greatest blessing the universe had ever granted me. He was a small, insecure man who needed a shallow, demanding woman to make him feel important. They truly deserved each other. They were locked in a prison of their own making, chained together by debt, lies, and absolute public ruin. I turned my attention away from their screaming match. I was thoroughly bored by their pathetic demise. The main act of the circus was concluding, and there was only one final piece of business left to handle before I completely closed this chapter of my life forever. I looked up at Julian, offering him a small, knowing smile. He nodded slightly, his dark eyes gleaming with lethal intent. It was time to deliver the final crushing blow. Marcus and Chloe continued their vicious public slaughter of their own marriage, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the now mostly abandoned ballroom. They were so consumed by their mutual hatred and financial panic that they did not even notice Julian stepping forward. He moved with a terrifyingly smooth, predatory grace, closing the distance between our table and their screaming match. He did not yell to get their attention. He simply reached out and placed his large, perfectly manicured hand flat against the center of their table. The impact was not loud, but the sheer, undeniable force behind the gesture sent a visible tremor through the wood, causing their crystal water glasses to violently tip and shatter onto the floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass instantly silenced them both. Marcus snapped his head up, his face flushed a furious, ugly purple, prepared to scream at whoever had interrupted him. But the moment his eyes locked onto Julian's towering frame, the breath was completely punched out of his lungs. Chloe shrank back, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, as if the expensive leather could somehow protect her from the absolute freezing authority radiating from my husband. Julian looked down at them with a clinical, detached expression, like a scientist observing a particularly disgusting species of insect. "I believe you two are being incredibly disruptive to my wife's peace," Julian stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble that commanded immediate, absolute obedience. "And since my wife has already graciously handled the professional execution of your pathetic careers, I believe it is my turn to handle the remaining domestic administrative details." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively. He took a small, involuntary step backward, but there was nowhere left for him to run. "What else could you possibly do to us?" Marcus choked out, his voice trembling with a mixture of pure terror and exhausted defeat. "Maya just took my job. She took my equity. We are completely ruined. You have already won. Just let us leave." Julian offered a slow, razor-sharp smile that did not reach his cold, dark eyes. "Oh, Marcus, you severely underestimate the thoroughness of my operations," Julian murmured smoothly. "You see, when a man disrespects the woman I love, when a man attempts to publicly humiliate my wife and the mother of my child, I do not just take his job. I dismantle his entire existence down to the absolute foundation. I ensure there is absolutely no ground left for him to stand on." Julian reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek silver monogrammed money clip. He did not pull out a business card. He simply held the clip, letting the light catch the heavy, expensive metal. "You were just shouting about a custom-built mansion in the suburbs." Julian continued, his tone conversational, yet laced with pure, concentrated venom. "You mentioned a closing date scheduled for this coming Tuesday. A highly leveraged, overpriced piece of real estate that requires a massive high-interest jumbo loan to secure. I assume you utilized a boutique lending firm to bypass the standard income verification protocols given your astronomical debt-to-income ratio." Chloe gasped, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked at Marcus silently, begging him to stop Julian from speaking, but Marcus was completely paralyzed. "Your boutique lender," Julian explained, pacing slowly around their table like a shark circling wounded prey, "is a small subsidiary branch of a much larger global banking conglomerate. A conglomerate that specializes in absorbing high-risk, toxic debt from desperate social climbing executives who live vastly beyond their means. It is a highly lucrative sector if you know exactly when to pull the plug." Julian stopped directly in front of Marcus, looking down at him from his towering height. "My private bank acquired that entire lending portfolio 3 days ago," Julian stated, dropping the final apocalyptic anvil onto Marcus's head. "I personally reviewed the high-risk mortgage applications. I saw your name. I saw the fraudulent income projections you submitted based on a corporate buyout you had not yet secured. And as the primary underwriter and owner of the bank, I possess the absolute unilateral authority to approve or deny any line of credit." The air in the ballroom seemed to completely freeze. Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but his vocal cords had entirely abandoned him. "As of this exact moment, your mortgage application is officially denied," Julian declared, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality. "The $300,000 deposit you put down to secure the build is entirely non-refundable as per the strict terms of your seller agreement. The bank will immediately initiate aggressive collection protocols to recover the administrative costs of your fraudulent application. Furthermore, the auto financing division of my bank holds the title to both of your luxury leases. Since you are now officially unemployed and your credit profile is about to implode, those vehicles are currently scheduled for immediate repossession. The tow trucks have already been dispatched to your current residence." Chloe let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek, collapsing completely into her chair. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing with the violent, agonizing realization that she was about to be homeless, carless, and utterly destitute by Tuesday morning. Marcus could not breathe. His knees physically buckled under the unbearable, crushing weight of total financial annihilation. He tried to grab the edge of the table to stabilize himself, but his hands were shaking too violently. The sheer magnitude of Julian's absolute power had completely broken him. Slowly, agonizingly, Marcus's legs gave out. He collapsed straight down onto the polished hardwood floor, landing hard on both knees directly in front of Julian. The arrogant, boastful venture capitalist who had spent the entire evening mocking my clothes and bragging about his elite status was now physically kneeling on the ground in a ruined suit, completely stripped of his dignity, his wealth, and his future. Julian looked down at the pathetic, weeping man, kneeling at his expensive leather shoes. He did not show a single ounce of mercy. "I want you to remember this exact position," Marcus Julian said, his voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper that sent a violent shiver down my spine. "I want you to remember what it feels like to be completely powerless. 5 years ago, you thought you could just discard my wife and walk away without facing any consequences. You thought your actions had no price. But the universe demands balance, and I am the one who collects the debt. I do not offer grace periods, and I absolutely do not offer mercy to men who betray my wife." Julian turned his back on the sobbing, broken man kneeling on the floor. He walked back to my side, seamlessly transitioning from a ruthless corporate executioner back into a fiercely protective, loving husband. He placed his hand gently on my shoulder, looking at me with nothing but absolute devotion. I sat perfectly still, processing the magnificent total destruction of the man who had nearly ruined my life. I looked down at Marcus, watching his tears stain the polished floorboards. He was begging now, muttering incoherent apologies and pleas for a second chance, but his words were completely meaningless to me. He was nothing but a ghost, a pathetic echo of a past I had completely conquered. The circus had officially ended. The clowns had been entirely stripped of their costumes, the tent had burned to the ground, and I was the one walking away with the absolute undisputed victory. I gently stroked Zuri's soft curls, taking a deep cleansing breath of the sudden perfect peace that had settled over the grand ballroom. The slate was completely wiped clean. Justice was not just served, it had been delivered with absolute lethal precision. I looked down at the pathetic weeping man kneeling on the polished hardwood floor. Marcus had completely folded in on himself. His broad shoulders shook with violent gasping sobs, his expensive tailored suit wrinkling around his collapsing frame. The man who had spent the last 5 years convincing himself he was a titan of industry was currently reduced to a trembling, broken mess. I observed him with a deep, profound sense of detachment. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I did not feel the fiery, blinding rage that had consumed me during the initial months of our divorce. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. "Stand up, Marcus," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it was absolute. It cut through his pathetic sobbing with surgical precision. Marcus slowly raised his head. His face was blotchy, his eyes bloodshot and wide with sheer terror. He tried to speak, but only a wet, choking sound escaped his throat. He weakly grabbed the edge of a nearby chair and hauled himself to his feet, unable to stand up straight. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, entirely incapable of meeting my gaze. "Look at yourself," I said, keeping my tone completely even and devoid of any emotional warmth. "You built an entire life out of deceit, stolen money, and unearned arrogance. You honestly believed that abandoning a grieving woman in a hospital bed was your stepping stone to greatness. You thought you could just discard me like damaged goods and walk straight into a billionaire lifestyle without facing any consequences. But true greatness requires character, Marcus. It requires integrity and resilience. You have absolutely none of those things. You are just a hollow, insecure man who needed to steal from his own wife to buy the illusion of success." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, fresh tears spilling down his flushed cheeks. "Maya, I am so sorry," he choked out, his voice cracking painfully. "I was stupid. I was greedy. Please, I will do anything. Just give me another chance." "There are no second chances in the real world," I replied coldly. "You wanted a purely transactional life. You traded your marriage for a promotion, and you traded your loyalty for a luxury car lease. Well, your transaction has officially been canceled. You are experiencing the natural, unavoidable consequences of your own vile actions." I turned to face the entire group, looking at Marcus, Chloe, Bradley, and Vivian. "This is the absolute unbreakable boundary," I announced, drawing a hard, invisible line in the space between us. "I am not your niece. I am not your safety net. I am not your collateral damage. I am the devastating consequence you never saw coming. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation wash over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating chains of familial obligation and toxic loyalty had been completely shattered. I had spent years quietly rebuilding my life, forging a kingdom out of the ashes they had left behind. I had walked into this venue as an outcast, but I was establishing my iron boundary as a conqueror. They had absolutely no power left to hurt me, manipulate me, or control my narrative. I had surgically removed their toxicity from my life, and I was never going to let the infection return. I turned my attention away from the sniveling, broken forms of my aunt and my ex-husband. I raised my head, squaring my shoulders, and projected my voice so that it carried effortlessly to the very back of the grand ballroom. The catering staff, the venue managers, and the remaining stragglers from the bridal party were all hovering in stunned silence. They were captivated by the absolute destruction that had just taken place. I wanted every single person in that room to hear my final decree. I wanted there to be zero ambiguity about the new reality I was establishing. "Let us make this severance official and legally binding right here and right now," I announced. My voice was crisp, cutting through the heavy air like a diamond blade. For my entire adult life, I was told that I owed this family a massive debt. I was told that my mere existence was a burden, that my career was a humiliating embarrassment, and that my failure to maintain a toxic, abusive marriage was a permanent stain on the pristine family legacy. You all demanded constant repayment in the form of my self-respect. You wanted me to continuously bow my head and accept your vile treatment just for the privilege of sitting at the absolute worst table in the room. I looked directly at Aunt Vivian, who was still trembling on the floor. "Aunt Vivian," I said smoothly, "you loudly demanded $1,500 to cover my presence at this reception. You desperately wanted to humiliate me over a catering tab in front of your wealthy white in-laws. Well, I have paid it. I have paid for this table, I have paid a massive premium to the venue staff, and I have paid for the absolute destruction of your fake social empire. My financial debt to this family is permanently cleared. I have bought my absolute freedom, and I paid in full. But let me be perfectly clear about what the future holds." I continued, my gaze sweeping across the faces of my stunned relatives. "This is the absolute end of our association. As of this exact second, I no longer have an aunt. I no longer have a cousin named Jasmine. I do not have a former husband or a former best friend. I have absolutely no blood ties to anyone standing in this room. The concept of family has been entirely revoked." I took a step forward, ensuring my words landed with maximum impact. "Do not attempt to call my personal phone. Do not attempt to show up at my corporate headquarters. Do not even think about approaching my husband. And if any of you ever dare to come within 50 feet of my daughter, my security team will not wait for a police escort to remove you. They have strict, unconditional orders to protect my child from any potential threat, and I officially classify all of you as highly hostile threats." I turned my focus back to Marcus and Chloe, who were huddled together in sheer terror. Furthermore, I stated, making sure they heard every single syllable, "You are strictly forbidden from using my name, Julian's name, or the Apex Capital brand to secure any form of credit, social standing, or employment. My legal department is already drafting the official cease and desist orders. They will be delivered by courier to your respective residences on Monday morning. If you attempt to leverage our history to save yourselves from the total financial ruin you have entirely brought upon your own heads, my attorneys will bury you in so much litigation that your non-existent grandchildren will be paying the legal fees." I let the threat sink in, watching Marcus visibly swallow hard. "Apex Capital employs a legal division that operates with a 9-figure annual budget," I explained coldly. "We destroy multinational corporations for sport. Do not make the fatal mistake of thinking we will hesitate to crush a few desperate, bankrupt social climbers. If you breathe a word of my name to the press, or if you attempt to sell a pathetic sob story to the local blogs about how unfairly you were treated, I will legally seize whatever miserable scraps you have left. I will take your remaining bank accounts. I will take the clothes out of your closets. I will ensure that your names are completely blacklisted across every single financial institution on the Eastern Seaboard. You will never secure a loan, a mortgage, or a corporate position ever again. You wanted me to be a failure because it made you feel superior. I said the absolute truth of the situation, ringing out with perfect clarity. You desperately needed a scapegoat to mask the rotting toxic dysfunction of your own miserable lives. But you chose the wrong woman to break. I did not just survive your cruelty. I weaponized it. I used every single insult, every single exclusion, and every single betrayal as fuel to build an empire that you cannot even comprehend. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a crowd that had just witnessed a total flawless execution. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to even shift their weight. The sheer magnitude of my warning had paralyzed them. They knew I was not making empty threats. They had just watched me effortlessly dismantle a $500 million venture capital deal and repossess a luxury mansion in the span of 30 minutes. They knew my words were backed by a bottomless, terrifying ocean of capital and a complete lack of mercy. I looked at the catering manager who was still standing rigidly by the kitchen doors. He was clutching the receipt from my black card as if it were a sacred religious text. "You can clear table 14 now," I told him smoothly. "The trash has already taken itself out." I turned my back on my former family for the final time. I did not look at Aunt Vivian. I did not look at Jasmine, whose ruined wedding dress was now a symbol of her completely shattered transactional marriage. I did not look at Marcus or Chloe, two pathetic parasites who were about to wake up tomorrow morning to a reality of absolute crushing poverty. They were entirely dead to me. They were nothing but ghosts from a past life that I had fully and completely conquered. This was the true meaning of severing the bloodline. It was not just about walking away. It was about cauterizing the wound so completely that the infection could never, ever return. I had spent 37 years bound by the toxic expectations of people who fundamentally hated me. I had bent over backward trying to prove my worth to a family that only valued my presence when they needed someone to humiliate. That era was officially over. I had ripped the toxic roots out of the ground, salted the earth, and paved it over with solid concrete. I was finally entirely free. Julian stepped forward, breaking the frozen tableau of the ballroom. He did not say a single word to the weeping, pathetic figures clustered on the floor around table 14. He simply reached up and unbuttoned his custom Tom Ford suit jacket. The movement was incredibly fluid, relaxed, and utterly devoid of the frantic, desperate energy that was currently consuming everyone else in the room. He slipped the heavy, immaculately tailored garment from his broad shoulders and gently draped it over mine. The dark silk lining was still wonderfully warm from his body heat. It carried the subtle, intoxicating scent of rich cedar, expensive bergamot, and pure, concentrated power. It was a physical shield, a luxurious, heavy barrier deliberately placed between me and the toxic, radioactive wasteland I was officially leaving behind. "Let us go home, Mrs. Sterling," Julian murmured. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that completely grounded me, cutting through the ambient noise of the breaking room. He did not ask if I was ready. He did not ask if I needed a moment to process. He knew I was absolutely finished. Julian effortlessly bent down and scooped Zuri into his arms. He lifted our 4-year-old daughter with practiced, gentle ease, settling her securely against his broad chest. Zuri wrapped her tiny, delicate arms around his neck, resting her cheek against his shoulder. She looked completely unbothered by the absolute devastation surrounding us. In her innocent, highly protected world, this was just another boring adult party coming to its natural end. "Are we going to see the big car now, Daddy?" Zuri asked, her bright, sweet voice slicing directly through the heavy, suffocating tension of the room like a silver bell. "We absolutely are, Princess." Julian smiled, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "The driver is waiting right out front." I pulled Julian's jacket tighter around my shoulders, feeling the comforting, grounding weight of the expensive fabric against my skin. I turned my back on table 14 for the very last time. I did not spare a single lingering glance for my ruined ex-husband or the treacherous woman who had stolen his massive impending debts. I did not look back at the hypocritical aunt who had tried to charge me a catering fee for the absolute privilege of being publicly humiliated. I simply took a breath, adjusted my posture, and began to walk. We moved together down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The pristine white runner, which had been rolled out just hours ago for a picture-perfect fairy tale wedding, was now scuffed, wrinkled, and stained with spilled wine. The entire atmosphere of the room had fundamentally shifted from a high society celebration to a chaotic, active disaster zone. The remaining guests practically scrambled out of our path. They parted for us as if we were conquering royalty, surveying the brutal aftermath of a newly claimed territory. They pressed themselves flat against the linen-covered tables, deliberately averting their eyes, utterly terrified of drawing even a fraction of our lethal attention. The sounds of the burning wreckage echoed loudly behind us, creating a chaotic, desperate symphony of absolute, undeniable ruin. I could hear Chloe screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. The panic had completely fractured her shallow mind. She was violently hitting Marcus in the chest, demanding to know how he was going to fix their imminent bankruptcy. She was shrieking about the yacht deposits, the luxury car leases, and the custom-built mansion that was currently slipping through her manicured fingers. Marcus was not even defending himself. I could hear his ragged, pathetic sobs as he remained kneeling on the floor, completely broken by the reality of his own catastrophic greed. Further down the aisle, the destruction of Jasmine's marriage was playing out in spectacular, humiliating fashion. Bradley was frantically shouting into his cell phone, desperately trying to reach his wealthy father, who had already abandoned him to his fate. Jasmine was sitting right in the middle of the polished dance floor, surrounded by discarded champagne flutes and crushed floral arrangements. She was weeping hysterically, pulling at the heavy, suffocating layers of her custom bridal gown, as if she were trying to physically escape the catastrophic transaction she had just married into. Her picture-perfect elite social event had devolved into a brutal, undeniable divorce before the catering staff had even served the main course. And then there was Aunt Vivian. As we walked past the center of the room, I caught a brief final glimpse of the fallen matriarch out of the corner of my eye. She was frantically grabbing the arm of an older, wealthy church elder, desperately trying to spin a new fabricated narrative. She was babbling incoherently, trying to claim that she had always supported me, that this was just a terrible misunderstanding caused by corporate stress. But the church elder simply pulled his arm away from her frantic grip with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He turned his back on her, walking quickly toward the exit. Aunt Vivian was left standing completely alone in a sea of abandoned tables, her social empire permanently reduced to absolute smoking ash. We did not stop. We did not slow our measured pace. We walked with the synchronized, effortless rhythm of a couple who had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. The heavy, ornate oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom loomed ahead of us. Two venue managers were standing rigidly by the exit. When they saw us approaching, they practically scrambled to pull the massive doors wide open, bowing their heads in deep, terrified reverence as we passed through. They knew exactly who held the real power in this city, and they wanted to ensure our exit was completely unobstructed. Stepping out of the ballroom and into the grand lobby of the venue felt like crossing the threshold into an entirely different universe. The suffocating, toxic air of the reception was instantly replaced by the cool, crisp, and beautifully quiet atmosphere of the luxury hotel. The frenzied screaming and hysterical sobbing of my former family became instantly muffled as the heavy oak doors clicked firmly and definitively shut behind us. The physical sensation of leaving them trapped in that room was intoxicating. They were locked inside a prison of their own making, entirely consumed by the financial and social apocalypse they had brought upon themselves. I had handed them the matches, and they had eagerly set their own house on fire. Now they were left to choke on the toxic smoke while I walked away completely unscathed. Julian shifted Zuri to one side, freeing his other hand to firmly interlock his fingers with mine. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not offer any unnecessary platitudes or ask if I felt guilty for what I had done. He already knew the answers. We walked across the polished marble floors of the lobby in perfect harmonious silence. The hotel staff parted for us, recognizing the undeniable aura of untouchable wealth and absolute authority. The concierge rushed forward to open the main glass doors leading out to the circular driveway. The cool, refreshing night air hit my face, carrying the faint scent of rain and city asphalt. It was the smell of absolute, unconditional freedom. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with oxygen that was no longer tainted by the desperate, grasping expectations of people who had never truly loved me. We stepped out under the massive crystal chandelier illuminating the valet pickup area, leaving the wreckage entirely behind us. The crisp night air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin as we stood beneath the towering crystal chandelier of the valet pickup area. We did not have to wait. The absolute second we stepped past the glass doors, a massive gleaming black Maybach Pullman smoothly pulled up to the curb. It moved with the silent, heavy grace of a customized armored vehicle, its engine emitting nothing more than a low, powerful purr. The deep tint of the bulletproof windows completely obscured the interior, projecting an aura of total, impenetrable privacy. The venue valets, who had been busy managing the chaos of the departing elite guests, practically scrambled out of the way. They recognized the sheer, undeniable presence of a vehicle that commanded the road, scrambling to stand at strict attention. My personal driver, a highly trained security specialist named Thomas, immediately stepped out. He moved with swift military precision, rounding the massive hood to open the heavy rear passenger door. He offered a respectful nod, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the perimeter to ensure our absolute safety. There was no hesitation, no lingering anxiety, and no fear of being followed or confronted. We were operating in a completely different stratosphere now, shielded by thick layers of wealth influence and physical protection that Marcus and Aunt Vivian could not even begin to fathom. Julian gently lowered Zuri into her custom leather car seat, his large hands moving with incredible tenderness that contrasted beautifully with his ruthless corporate demeanor. He secured her 5-point harness, making sure she was perfectly comfortable before pressing one last kiss to her forehead. I slid into the plush heated leather seat next to her, pulling Julian's tailored suit jacket a little closer around my shoulders. The moment Julian stepped in, and the heavy armored door clicked firmly shut, the ambient noise of the city and the distant muffled sounds of the chaotic wedding reception vanished entirely. The cabin of the Maybach was perfectly soundproofed. It was an absolute sanctuary of silence wrapped in the rich scent of new leather and subtle designer cologne. I leaned my head back against the soft reclining headrest, closing my eyes for just a fraction of a second. I let out a long, slow breath. It was the deepest, most cleansing breath I had taken in exactly 5 years. The heavy, suffocating weight that had rested on my chest since the day I miscarried and discovered my husband's horrific betrayal was completely gone. I was no longer carrying the toxic burden of their expectations. I was no longer chained to the desperate, pathetic need to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of loving me. The slate was completely wiped clean. The emotional debt had been paid in full and the account was permanently closed. Julian reached across the wide, illuminated center console and gently took my hand. His long fingers intertwined with mine, his grip solid and immensely reassuring. He did not say a single word. He did not need to ask how I was feeling or if I regretted dropping the corporate guillotine on my former family. He already knew. He could feel the absolute profound peace radiating from me in the quiet cabin. We had walked into a den of venomous vipers and we had walked out completely untouched, leaving the snakes to eagerly devour each other in the dark. As the Maybach smoothly pulled away from the curb, gliding seamlessly into the nighttime traffic with zero resistance, Zuri let out a tiny, curious sigh. She was playing with the edge of her cream-colored tulle dress, her bright eyes looking around the spacious cabin before settling squarely on my face. The innocent, unbothered expression on her face was the absolute greatest reward I could have ever asked for. She had witnessed the total destruction of an entire social empire, and to her it was nothing more than a noisy, boring room filled with unpleasant adults. Mommy Zuri asked, her sweet melodic voice breaking the comfortable silence of the car. Who were those loud people back there? Why was that fancy lady yelling so much? I looked at my beautiful, brilliant daughter. I thought about the specific people she was asking about. A manipulative, abusive ex-husband who threw away his marriage for a cheap, superficial upgrade. A backstabbing former best friend who sold her soul for designer handbags and leased vehicles. A hypocritical aunt who worshipped money above basic human decency. A weak, arrogant groom who thought a job title made him a king. They were the exact people who had tried to absolutely destroy me. They were the people who had laughed at my physical pain and mocked my agonizing struggles. They had genuinely believed that I would spend the rest of my life crawling in the dirt, completely broken by their cruelty. I looked from Zuri to Julian. My husband was watching me with a look of pure, unconditional adoration and immense, overwhelming pride. He had handed me the ultimate weapon, but he had stepped back and allowed me to pull the trigger entirely on my own terms. He had empowered me to reclaim my narrative and execute my own flawless, undeniable justice without stepping on my agency. I squeezed Julian's hand, feeling the solid weight of his wedding band against my palm. Then I leaned over to gently stroke my daughter's soft cheek. I offered her a warm, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes, unburdened by any remaining sorrow. They were just strangers, baby. I answered softly, the absolute truth ringing perfectly clear in the quiet, moving sanctuary. Just strangers. Let us go home. Zuri nodded happily, completely satisfied with the simple answer. She snuggled back into her comfortable seat, her eyes already growing heavy as the gentle hum of the powerful engine lulled her towards sleep. She would never know the toxicity of the people we had just left behind. She would never have to experience conditional love, emotional manipulation, or financial abuse. She was safe, infinitely adored, and fiercely protected by a mother who had conquered the world. I turned my head to look out the tinted window. The towering, illuminated facade of the wedding venue was rapidly shrinking in the distance, quickly swallowed up by the sprawling, glittering lights of the majestic city skyline. Somewhere inside that building, Marcus was realizing he was entirely bankrupt. Chloe was weeping over her repossessed luxury cars. Aunt Vivian was hyperventilating over her permanently destroyed social status. Their nightmare was only just beginning, and it was entirely of their own making. But I did not care. Their misery was no longer my concern. I had spent years meticulously building an empire out of the absolute ruins they had left me in. I had transformed every single tear, every single insult, and every single moment of agonizing betrayal into raw, unstoppable power. I had forged myself into a titan untouchable and utterly victorious. As the Maybach glided toward our private estate, surrounded by my loving husband and my beautiful child, I realized the absolute greatest truth of all. The best revenge is not anger. It is not screaming or crying or demanding apologies from people incapable of giving them. The best revenge is completely evicting them from your reality. The best revenge is attaining a level of success so massive, so undeniable, and so brilliant that it actively blinds the people who tried to keep you in the dark. I had won the ultimate war by simply refusing to play their pathetic game anymore. I had secured my absolute peace, and my life was finally perfectly and entirely my own. The most powerful lesson from Maya's journey is that true vindication doesn't come from matching toxicity with desperate pleas. It comes from radical self-reliance and unbreakable boundaries. When toxic people try to bury you, you don't have to seek their approval or fight for a seat at their miserable table. Instead, you can use their betrayal as fuel to build your own empire in absolute silence. The ultimate revenge is simply massive, undeniable success, and the realization that your worth never depended on their validation. True peace is found the exact moment you completely evict them from your reality. Share your own story of overcoming toxic environments in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button for more empowering tales of resilience and triumph.